Great. Okay, so maybe I'll just say briefly again, because we were a bit belated in starting the recording, that this is the second part of a two-part panel on counter-agrarian reform in the Global South, dynamics of accumulation and change. And we've agreed that we'll just, each of the paper authors will give a brief summary of their presentation and pose any questions that they want the group to consider. And then we'll sort of open up the floor, and you're welcome to raise your questions or comments at that point. So I think, ironically, I'm actually the first person listed in this panel. So I will go first, and then I don't know if Mazibuko is here. Let me just scan and see. I don't see him or her. So we may be missing that person. And then Kobe, you or Richard or both can speak about your paper, and then that's followed by another paper by you. So I don't know if you want to maybe speak to both at once, or I will leave that up to you. But maybe I can get us started. And some of you will have already heard this, that I have a 5-month-old who is a little bit noisy beside me. So if you hear small noises, that's who it is. So yeah, the central argument of my paper, which I will need to look at the title again because I have forgotten exactly what I called it. From accumulation by dispossession to accumulation by reparations, undoing the redistributive remit of contemporary land programs in Canada and South Africa. So the central argument of my paper is that there are now instances where reparative land programs, so the programs associated with what we call land reform in South Africa or land claims in Canada, those are the two locations that I mostly work in, Canada and South Africa. There are now instances where these programs are being harnessed and co-opted by financial and agribusiness capital. And I see these as instances of counter-agrarian reform because they sharply circumscribe the redistributive ambitions of the long-running land struggles that sort of resulted in these land reform and land claims programs. So that is, the cases that I study show reparative land programs benefiting elites rather than the rural Black communities in South Africa or First Nations in Canada, who are arguably meant to benefit from these land programs. And I make this argument through an examination of two recent large-scale agricultural investment projects, so one in each of the countries, one in Canada, one in South Africa, which arose after the financial crisis amidst the financialization of the agricultural sectors, and which also sort of articulated with ongoing national reconciliatory efforts. And in the paper presentation that you guys will view online, I focus on my South African case study. I'm happy to refer you to my Canadian work if you're interested in it, and trace the ways that agribusiness and financial capital are appropriating value from the country's land reform programs, from South Africa's land reform programs. And I suggest that this points to the limitations of reparative land programs in liberal, democratic, advanced capitalist societies. So I mentioned, for those who were part of the last panel, I mentioned that I posed two questions at the end of my presentation, and then I sort of dropped a third one into the mix. So maybe I could just restate those. So one is, what are the similarities and differences across different instances or cases of counter-agrarian reform? What are the key drivers of counter-agrarian reform? And conversely, what mechanisms might exist for preventing or interrupting it? And then the third one is, what exactly is being countered? What do we, what is the expected outcome that's going undelivered, so to speak? What did we expect to happen that isn't happening? I think it's really important to get that question clear in our collective minds. So yeah, that's it from me. And who is next on our list? Mazibuko, is Mazibuko here? No.
Mazibuko is not here.
Okay. So then maybe we can go to Richard. I don't know if you or Kobe want to speak or some combination of the two, but please feel free to give a quick summary of your work and any questions you want us to consider.
Okay, thanks. No, we'd agreed. Nobi will introduce his paper and our paper. I'll just briefly give an overview of that myself. So thank you for the opportunity. This paper is really about the untruth of land reform in South Africa and counter-agrarian reform. And what we do in the paper that we have developed is we look at the class character of the transition. And then we pose the question as to whether it was characterized by popular democratic or bourgeois democratic transformation. And this is because those two narratives or discourses are very much reflected in the frameworks which have been developed, including the Constitution. So we do problematize the kind of compact that was formed in the so-called Rainbow Nation, where elevation of private property meant that it featured in the Bill of Rights as a protection. And we have a situation where more than half of South Africans do not have secure land tenure. And there has been a large failure historically and contemporaneously to mobilize mass support behind land reform and transformation of rural social relations. So I think the Constitution does protect private property, but it also provides for expropriation with just and equitable compensation when it comes to general law of application. So we do focus a lot of the work we're doing on labor tenancy, and labor tenants were recognized as a particular category of people living on white farms. The legal categorization is problematic, but one won't discuss it in this brief overview. But nonetheless, we have a situation where, despite the legislation which protects the rights of labor tenants, brutality continued on white farms post-apartheid up until the present day. And there are some case studies which we present in our paper, which illustrate this graphically. And then we indicate that the law has not really been utilized. And in fact, what happens in the law is that private property is fetishized in as much as the different conditions which must shape just and equitable compensation are not simply in the Constitution shaped by market value, but that's been the legal precedent that has been set. And this obviously constrains land reform, and the kind of land reform program that we have does not really benefit the poor, the marginalized, the excluded, commodity producers, small commodity producers on white farmland, who continue to endure the most horrendous conditions of existence up until the present. So that, in a nutshell, is what our paper is about. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Richard. And Kobe, hopefully, if you've now logged in, hopefully we'll be able to hear you again, because I think you're next step to give a quick summary of your solo authored paper.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melanie. Since Trevor has joined us and he was supposed to present in the previous session, maybe it's best if he presents and then I go after him.
Sure. Yeah, we can do them in that order. He can go after you. It doesn't matter to me. Trevor, do you want to jump in now then?
Okay. Thank you very much. My apologies for missing that session. You know, it's either old age or just confusion. Yeah, okay. So I wanted to talk about racial capitalism, which is a concept which is being revived in South Africa today, inspired by what happened with Black Lives Matter in the US, you know, where because of the murder of George Floyd, there was a renewed interest in the concept of racial capitalism. Why are Black bodies continually being attacked, being killed, despite the so-called democracy, especially in the light of a black guy, Obama, having been president. And then the Americans, especially African-American scholars, started reading again the works of Cedric J. Robinson, who wrote that famous book, seminal book, Black Marxism, where he developed the concept of racial capitalism somewhat. But then we found as South Africans that actually this concept originates in South Africa by Martin Legasik, Dave Hampson, who were actually our comrades. Martin unfortunately passed away, and in a paper they wrote in 1979. Now, in a way, I view it as a legacy and an inheritance, which, we have to take forward. And then the other thing is that most theorizations of the land question in South Africa have not really helped us, in what is basically a logjam. There is a slowdown in land restitution that is giving back the land, which, legally it was decided, those people who lost land under apartheid, forced removals, especially after 1913, would be given back their land. So that process has been very slow. And just now, Richard was talking about the labor tenants. The law says those people who are paying labor rent, should put in claims and get that land back or be given that land. And that has been terribly, devastatingly slow. And then thirdly, land redistribution in general, especially in the light of poverty, landlessness, unemployment. So in a way, there is a kind of, I think, political stroke, theoretical stroke, ideological crisis. So I thought maybe, with this inspiration of Black Lives Matter, going back to racial capitalism as an overarching framing of the problem of land, of the agrarian question might help. And then there's just one or two things I can say. There are, with hindsight, with many people writing, and also the recent interest in the States, there are definite steps forward in this theorization. For example, it has been established that there is what we call the simultaneity, the coexistence of racial oppression and class exploitation, of racism and capital accumulation. And that it's not a functional relationship. Sometimes there is a degree of functionalism where capital benefits from race, ideologies, but it's a contingent. So it's contingent and it keeps on changing. It's conjunctural. And most importantly, for this paper, some authors have argued it's particularistic in the sense that we should look at each situation, each historical period, indeed, each country or region, in terms of how we can apply or look at racial capitalism as a framing. And then another point maybe, which maybe then, I could talk about just 1 minute, is the content of what I call continuities of elements of racial capitalism. So basically, we had our transition, but it looks like, what Martin Legasik called racial capitalism, elements of it still remain. Landlessness, unemployment, etc., racial disparities in land ownership, white supremacy, what you call Baskap in the countryside, and also the strengthening of chiefs of so-called traditional rulers. And then what mechanisms, make this to happen? There is someone who writes, Pam Christie writes in Education, she calls it transition tricks. So during the transition from apartheid to the new order, certain tricks, certain stratagems were used to make sure that some elements were carried forward. Of course, there are also new tricks coming in. For example, white capital, white agriculture, privatized the maize board, the egg board, all the kind of statutory subsidies to white agriculture, and then it became privatized. The same thing, which the Russian oligarchs, did to state enterprises in the US. But also the aspirant black bourgeoisie, including the chiefs, are finding new ways of actually, continuing this legacy of landlessness, of inequality. So my last point is that, given what has happened, our history, also given the fact that the concept itself, racial capitalism, in my opinion, I might be wrong, I'm still writing this paper, the concept tended to be urban biased, in the spirit of Sam Moyo. It tended to be a mining focused or focusing on manufacturing. I think more has to be done on looking at the concept in terms of land and the agrarian question. So this is a theoretical project, and I think that maybe, my paper can help us navigate this. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Comrade Trevor. I think I should go ahead with my paper. Melanie has just stepped out to attend to Ivo, her baby, who has been part of this panel. Yeah, Ivo is a future agrarian scholar. Yeah. So my work is about the impoverished landed property in South Africa. So here I'm talking about a class of land beneficiaries who are forced by the downward compulsion of economic forces to rent out their land, especially back to white farmers, because they do not have the means to invest in farm production themselves. And also because the state is failing to provide them with agricultural subsidies. And therefore, they have to rent out their land in order to socially reproduce themselves. I have identified two forms of an impoverished landed property. One on communally owned land reform farms, and another on privately owned land reform farms. So in communally owned land reform farms, you get local elites who are renting out large-scale pieces of land to different fragments of agrarian capital. Yet within those communal forms, there are marginalized people who are nominal owners of the land, but the local elites within communal property associations overpower them, and they rent out the land and do not distribute the dividends to what I call the impoverished landed property within communal forms of land reform farms. And then you get an impoverished landed property on privately owned land reform farms. So some farm workers, though few of them were lucky to get land in South Africa, and some of them have gotten private title deeds as a result. And they are also renting out land to mainly white farmers as well. And they are getting some rental income out of that for their social reproduction. But then, when you look at this, one may easily think that, privatization of land is the way to go because people can rent out their land and get some form of income from it. But actually, this whole movement of titling, this whole World Bank movement of titling actually prepares the soil for the control of the land by bigger agrarian capital and dispossession of the land from the marginalized classes who lack the resources to invest in expanded farm production. So those are the dynamics of counter agrarian reform, which includes privatization. Privatization does lay the ground for future dispossession, for future control of the land by the people who had been controlling the land before. They resuscitate in private forms of capital, because it simply individualizes the decision making onto the household. And actually, within those households, you may find that there's further marginalization, because the deal may be struck between the patriarch and the capitalist, and the rest of the family members may be left out. So those are the elements that constitute what we call tendencies of counter-agrarian reform, which actually takes us back to what land redistribution should have been, or whom should it benefit, and whom is it benefiting now, and with what ideological frameworks are we looking into this situation, what theoretical grounds do we draw as scholars, as scholar activists, and what futures do we anticipate when we see these tendencies, and what interventions can we have, especially interventions that will take the side of the oppressed. Thank you very much. Melanie, are you back from attending to
Yeah. I'm back.
Okay.
Hopefully he stays asleep. I just relocated him a little further from his mom's voice. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe we can just open up the floor. What do you think, to people who may have comments or questions, or yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, Melanie. So the floor is yours, colleagues. Maybe we are all wrong about what we are saying about counter-agrarian reform. And Godfrey, in our test session, he was making some remarks. Maybe you would like to expand here, Godfrey?
Yeah, Jeffrey, maybe you could jump in, and just because we didn't catch that on the recording, and sort of summarize your perspective as a development practitioner.
Sure, okay. Thank you very much. And I should start by saying I'm been very interested to hear what the colleagues have managed to say, struggling through the tech problems. But to repeat what I was saying between the sessions, I've been a practitioner in this very specific area for a long time, including a lot in Zimbabwe. I was actually a civil servant in Lesotho for a while, so I'm aware of it that way. But to cut to the chase, the point I was hoping to raise, well, the question I was hoping to raise was that I could go away with a proper understanding of what counter-agrarian reform means in this discussion now. I think I'm getting there, but the 2 points I would raise is, one is land reform is not the same thing as agrarian reform, and that the second point is that however agrarian reform is visualized or conceived, the system at the end has to be sustainable, and it has to be sustainable in its own right. And the disaster for most of the semi-arid areas is the land we're talking about has been trashed comprehensively, firstly by inappropriate industrial agricultural methods carried from Europe, from a temperate zone, but secondly by the inescapable fact that the population pressure on this finite resource has increased and increased and increased. I think in Zimbabwe the rural population has quadrupled since independence, and with a static technology and a dwindling resource, it's very, very hard to see how realistically people can be expected to make a living on a bit of land which they're left with. So that's my point. I'm not wanting to make a speech, but
yeah.
I think for sure it's an extremely worrying situation we're going for. And the observation that we've had thieves within the political system and within the commercial system who are rolling over the rural poor, that's not contested. But in the end, you can't have an agricultural sector thriving in an artificial, unsustainable space. You can't have long-term subsidies from the state to that enterprise, because, you know, but where does that finish? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. I think we can leave it there. We have reservations, of course, about agricultural subsidies. You know, we also want to talk about reparations. You know, perhaps real reparations.
But I think,
okay, Melanie,
oh.
I know I've provoked you there with reparations. Maybe you want to expand.
Well, what I was going to say, whoops, I just opened a weird window on my Zoom, is that I do think that Jeffrey's point is interesting. Your first point about, you know, land reform is not the same as agrarian reform. And I wondered if your perspective as a development practitioner is that perhaps we focused too narrowly on land reform and without sufficient attention to other aspects that maybe need to come with land. But maybe that's me putting my own lens on your point, because for me, I mean, one of the things that I would say is that in many, certainly in South Africa and to a large extent in Canada as well, while there's been land claims and land reform programs which have devolved, you know, ownership of rural farmland to communities, to historically oppressed communities, it has not always come with the very state subsidies that you then go on to say, well, maybe they're problematic. You know, it has not come with the state subsidies that in both countries, white farmers, for example, enjoyed for generation after generation. It has not come with access to financial capital, et cetera. So, you know, again, this is sort of my argument, but I would argue that part of the problem is that we're not providing enough subsidies, or we're not providing. So yeah, I don't know. I'm interested in what yours or what feedback you or others may have on that point.
Yeah, thank you so much, Melanie. Janet Cherry, you were with us in the previous session and you are still with us here, and we appreciate that very much. And if you may have some remarks, please go ahead, or some observations that you may have. Oh, okay. Otherwise, colleagues, the floor is open for comments and questions.
Okay, I'll have a stab at the issue of agrarian reform not being the same as land reform, which isn't a false statement, but at the same time, you can't look at land reform outside the context of agrarian reform, because it's a key component of the agrarian question, particularly in the settler countries that we live in, like South Africa. But even beyond, that was always a key issue in the classical debates on the agrarian question. So the relationship between town and country is fundamental historically. In South Africa, it's still fundamental, as well as the relationship between industry and agriculture. And we know that successful land reform in parts of East Asia really paved the way for a much greater internal market for industrial goods. And that's what South Africa probably aspires to without acknowledging it, because it calls itself a developmental state, but doesn't really talk about the interrelationship between industrialization and the expansion of agriculture beyond the traditional boundaries, because that's really the untruth of land reform, is really it's focusing on maintaining the status quo in agriculture and just adding things on for people who are dumped on land with inappropriate forms of governance of that land, which haven't worked, and no alternatives are really being looked at in a serious way. At the same time, you know, in South Africa, we do need to talk about urban land reform and what this will imply, because there are just masses of people precariously perched and you know, literally hanging on to little pieces of land on the peripheral areas of towns in many of the big metropolitan areas, and including KwaZulu-Natal. If you travel between Maritzburg and Durban, you're actually going to see on the hillside as you come closer to Cato Manor and the surrounds. The same with Nelspruit when you travel towards Maputo, and you move from Nelspruit through the areas around the toll gate, Matsulu and so on. You see people precariously hanging on. But of course, throughout the entire countryside, small towns have small petty commodity producers camped on the edges. They still maintain herds of cattle. They use gardens for whatever purposes they can. And that's the energy which we need to really tap into and begin to look at food security in a new way, and not simply focus on industrial agriculture, which, as Jeffrey says, is trashing the land in many respects. And recently one read of an example in the Western Cape where a farmer had abandoned his land, and 4 actual Zimbabwean nationals, as it were, as it transpired, asked him if they could use his land. They're able to revitalize that land, and they put it to amazing productive use. That was an interesting case study that one came across in the last few days. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Comrade Richard. George, your hand is up. Please go ahead, Comrade.
Oh, thanks, Comrade, and thanks to so many presenters, especially on SA. On SA, maybe I would want probably to see a deeper interrogation of why broad-based land reform has failed, especially the expropriation without compensation. You know, probably before we talk of the counter-agrarian, is there a broad-based land reform first in South Africa? I would want to know more about that, because if we, for example, a comparative study with Zimbabwe, we are talking of a broad-based land reform. Then if you go to South Africa, people are talking of the Ben Cousins, delay, deny, deceive, which means probably if we get to some stage, people would say there's no land reform in South Africa, you know, land reform in the classical way. So maybe we would want to know why land reform is failed in South Africa, or is there land reform in the first place before we talk of the counter in South Africa? Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, George. We don't have much time left. I would like to invite further comments, closing remarks, colleagues.
Yeah, so if I can just respond to George, because it's a good question. Is there any land reform in the first place? You could ask the same question about, has there been any, let's say, education, reform in education, you know, reform in land use, spatial, you know, because apartheid geography continues, socioeconomic, you know, characteristics, attributes, you know, if you black, you poor, if you white, you rich. So I would agree there. In fact, that is my motivation for, you know, looking at racial capitalism, kind of framing it broader, because many people tell you, I think Richard was mentioning, you know, the transition basically capitalism was left intact. Can you see? But of course, it couldn't be left exactly as it was. New ways were found. Yeah, but those ways, you know, are a real problem because in some respects, you know, there is a pushback to something which had been gained. For example, you know, Ngobi likes talking about what, you know, Stella talks, legitimating narratives, legitimating architectures of racism, such as blacks can't farm. Can you see? So those are the kind of things, you know, which, you know, racial capitalism raises and also helps us to see the commonality with other situations, certainly with Black Americans, you know, their situation. So I would agree with you. That's a key question, actually.
Yeah, thank you so much, Comrade Trevor. It's unfortunate that one of our colleagues from Bolivia, he couldn't join us, but these dynamics are similar, you know, to the Latin American context. Dynamics of racialized capitalism, of limited land reforms. We are supposed to be ending, but I would like to read out this question from Janet Cherry, who's saying that, can you respond to the question of whether communal land rights are more appropriate than individual property rights? Maybe I could say a few remarks regarding that. What's most dangerous about individual property rights is that, you know, title deeds are just given to poor people, and those title deeds actually lead to land dispossession in the long run. We see desperate people who have been given land, given title deeds, and someone may just come and take that land and give that person some money, and the land is gone just like that. And you know, I think there is progress in thinking about communal forms of property which are free from oppressive elements, which are free from local elitism that literally dispossesses. So colleagues, we have ran out of time, but maybe you may have some closing remarks.
I just want to say a quick thank you to everybody for joining in on the panel. It's, you know, it's been really interesting to just even get some conversations around this started. So, and as you mentioned, Kobe, I know a number of us are hoping to develop a special issue along these lines. So if it speaks to your work, then please do reach out to us. And that's open, that offers open to practitioners as well. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I just hope we can also get time to pursue this discussion as soon as we can, probably outside this conference, so that there are a lot of unanswered questions, you know, and the time was very short to hear a lot from Richard and from everyone. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, colleagues, comrades, thank you so much for attending, and let's keep the conversation going. Please feel free to share your ideas with us, papers, and what you make of the concept of counter-agrarian reform. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ngobe, and thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.